and he decided he would establish his state in Cape Mount, and he called it a principality. And he was going to be the prince. You
Wow.
see, his background was Italian and French. So
Yeah.
in Italy, you had a lot of
Royalty.
principalities, right?
Mhm.
So he sets it up. He designs a flag for his country, and he intended to become a direct competitor and alternative to the Republic of Liberia. So the character of the slave trade changed to where they now started hunting children.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Carl Patrick Burroughs uh, on and about his book, Liberia and the Quest for Freedom, the Half That Has Never Been Told. If this is a series, so if you haven't watched part 1, please go back and watch it and then come back, and it will make following the story a lot easier. Dr. Burroughs, hello and welcome.
Yes, glad to be back with you.
Okay. So we left off with Mr. Theophilus Conneau, the notorious slave trader, who fell on hard times in Europe and then came to West Africa to try his hand at the slave trade. Let's just recap that by way of starting the conversation today.
Yeah, so Conneau, we know about his activities primarily because of him, through him. After he was expelled from our region for the second time, the first time he was actually imprisoned in France. And then when he got out, he came back to West Africa and was active in the slave trade along the Windward Coast, which is primarily what we call Liberia today, the coast of Liberia. So he was active there. And the second time he was expelled, he ended up in Baltimore. And he was telling stories about his adventures in Africa and so on. And people encouraged him to get a novelist to write his memoir. And he ended up recording his years, his adventures and all of that in a book that has been reprinted several times.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know is that not only was he successful, but the man that he worked for in our region, one Pedro Blanco, was even more successful than Conneau. And Conneau in Baltimore ended up getting married to the niece of Napoleon of France.
Oh, really?
Yep. So that tells
Wow.
you, the kind of circles he was moving in based on the income that he had acquired. When Blanco ended up being driven out from the Galinas area, the man was so wealthy. He had what in effect was a multinational corporation focused on the selling of captive Africans. And he had a bank, he had a trading business that was linked to the slave trading. They had operations in Texas, in Cuba, Spain, and he was living in the Galinas to supervise the capturing
Wow.
and exportation of Africans. When he found out that it would be more profitable for him if he had his own ships, he acquired ships. Yeah. So I mean, this was not a business that one could say the profits were marginal.
Yeah.
No, they were very, very
So,
profitable.
so Conneau comes to West Africa and gets rich, basically.
Yes.
How did his end come about?
Uh, One could say that, he was, as is true for a lot of people who get involved in these types of businesses, right? Where they're looking for quick money. He became a little too greedy, one could say. So he was driven from the Crew Coast after he had been repeatedly warned. Uh, he ended up being forced out. So he moved to Cape Mount, and he set himself up in Cape Mount in a way that was far beyond anything that he had operated with before.
How
He
so?
de- he decided, right, that because this colony existed, which was centered around Monrovia, the thing we call Liberia at the time was only a few towns. So right around the St. Paul River area, Monrovia was the principal town. So he decided, oh, these folks have set up what they're calling a republic. He would do his own. And he decided he would establish his state in Cape Mount. And he called it a principality. And he was going to be the prince.
Wow.
You see, his background was Italian and French. So
Yeah.
in Italy, you had a lot of
Royalty.
principalities, right? Mm-hmm. So he sets it up. He designs a flag for his country. And he intended to become a direct competitor and alternative to the Republic of Liberia. Wow. He said, y'all want to be abolitionists? We'll have a slave state next to you. But that ambitiousness triggered the attention of the British. And they decided they needed to get the evidence on him. He wasn't an American. Their remit gave them authority to intercept American traders.
And he was not American.
But he was not American.
Wow.
And that was for the American anti-slavery squadron. For the British, it was similar. They could intercept British traders, but it was complicated if they got involved with non-British. But they waited until they could collect the evidence on him, and then they moved. And he escaped and ended up in Baltimore.
So I don't know if this meeting between Conneau and Buchanan took place before the escape or not, but I know at some point,
yes,
he basically accused the Americans of being hypocrites.
Yes.
He said, how can you be practicing slavery in your country,
yes,
and then you want to come to Africa and tell me to stop being involved in the slave trade? For me, that was a seminal moment in reading the book, because it shows how cunning
yes,
Conneau was, and the complexity of the situation at the time.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. The situation was such that, especially for the Americans, there was this effort ongoing for several decades to forge a kind of compromise, right, between those in the South who owned plantations, who had, some of the plantations had hundreds of enslaved Africans. So they wanted to form a compromise between those in the South and people in the North who were anti-slavery. And American politicians kept trying to balance those interests, especially someone like Henry Clay, right, who was known as a great compromiser. And his politics clearly was embodied in the American Colonization Society, which he headed for a while, because that group was trying to compromise to balance between, those things that were almost irreconcilable. Eventually, the conflict of contradiction exploded. America had a civil war. But Conneau perceived, right, this hypocrisy, if you will, and he was more than willing to use it and to use the argument in his book, in fact, and say, but look at you trying to block us from supplying you with slaves. Now, if you think about it, these arguments are used oftentimes by people who are engaged in illegal or nefarious activities. I hear it a lot from people who are trying to justify corruption in Liberia, for example, right? Or in other parts of Africa. They say, well, why are making noise about corruption here, and they got corruption, in the West? While it's true, corruption exists in all societies, but the reality is that in some places it flourishes because there's no attempt to police and to punish, whereas in other places we hear about it in the news when someone, who is well known, politician or otherwise, is sentenced to prison, like the governor of Illinois a few years ago, right? So that's a different environment altogether. But yet you'll hear people who want to justify wrongdoing make those arguments. Yeah.
Another topic I want to bring up for us to talk about is, and let me preface this by saying that we don't want to give credence to white people, for lack of a better word, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were indigenous people who really fought against the slave trade, granted. Yes. But I want to touch on the role of the British and the American anti-slavery squadrons. Mm-hmm. I mean, these were official government vehicles and vessels on sea who were anti-slavery, taking part in stopping the slave trade. Mm-hmm. How extensive was official government involvement, British and American anti-slavery squadrons?
Yes. Now, they were very important and they were instrumental in varying degrees. But I want to start with this preface, right? And I feel the need to do this because what has happened over the years is the acceptance of the idea that the West introduced abolitionism and the West was responsible for the abolition of slavery. The point I want to make, simply because it's not that well known, is that Africans were the original abolitionists. From the moment the traffic began, there were Africans who were pushing against it on the continent. And of course, once people reached the Americas, the Haitian Revolution was an example of that. However, the British took the lead in outlawing the trade in captured Africans. So initially, they banned the trade. They made it illegal for British citizens to engage in the trading of captured Africans. But for several decades after that, the British maintained slavery in the Caribbean. Are you following?
Wow.
I mean, there goes that contradiction
again. Say that again.
The British outlawed the traffic in captured Africans, but they maintained for several decades slavery, plantation slavery in the Caribbean on their islands. And so even after the slavery was abolished in the Caribbean, they still said the Africans needed to be indentured to the plantation owners before they could actually be let free, completely free.
And what does that mean in everyday English, indentured?
It's a situation where you are committed legally to work for someone in exchange for certain, things, or food or clothes or whatever. So it's a condition that's different from slavery. It's a higher level, and there's a point, an end point, where it is given that you will be in this situation for so many years, and then after that, you're on your own.
Okay.
It used to be very common in many parts of the world, and in Europe, people would be indentured, but usually children. And then when you reach the age of majority, you will be on your own, so to speak.
So in answer to my last question, you actually laid the premise beautifully that local people were involved in the abolition of slavery from the get-go.
Yeah, and then the British come in.
Yeah, and then so let's go back to the question, bringing the British and American anti-slavery squadrons. I understand between 1843 and 1861.
Yeah,
and to put this in terms of a time context, Liberia becomes an independent country or declares independence in 1847. So between 1843 and 1861, slavery was still going on. From your book, we understand that 51 slave ships were seized during that time.
Yeah. Now, there was a difference in the commitment to abolition of the British versus the Americans.
What was the difference?
The British, there was a sustained campaign by private citizens, right? A lot of them were clerics, and some lawyers and others, and they pushed public opinion from being very supportive of slavery and the slave trade or being indifferent to it. They pushed public opinion to the point where it became against, right? British public opinion, that is. And once that took hold, they had people sign petitions to send to Parliament to say you need to abolish this. And eventually it occurred. And the British then put their money where their mouth was in terms of intercepting slave ships. So when they decided that they were going to do this, they went in, with full commitment. Ships were stationed in Freetown, and they would go from there along the coast, intercept slave ships, and then Africans on the ships liberated would be brought to Freetown, communities like Waterloo and places like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many more thousands of liberated Africans who settled in Freetown as a result, because the British Navy was much more active. With the Americans, they followed the British lead in part because of pressure from the British. You follow?
Mm-hmm.
But here's the difference. The British public were not exposed to slavery internally. They were not living on plantations or near plantations and so on. For them, their plantations were far away,
In the Caribbean.
on these islands. And so they could distance themselves psychologically from the maintenance of those that type of economy. But with the Americans, there was always this kind of attempt to balance. And so once the Congress moved to abolish the traffic in slaves, in captured Africans, the effort was lukewarm. It was not as firm as the British. The reason Liberia was affected by the American effort is this. When the Americans would capture a slave ship and free the Africans from it, initially there was an attempt for them to be brought to the U.S. and there was pushback right away. So one case that a lot of people know about, was the Amistad. In the case of the Amistad, Africans had rebelled aboard a slave ship and they overpowered the crew, they took control of it, and they ended up in the U.S. But once they were taken off the ship, the question was what to do with them. And there was a long, series of court cases. Eventually, they were freed, and they were encouraged to go back to Sierra Leone, right? Sierra Leone, Liberia, that border area is where they were from. So the American public was divided as to if the American Navy got involved in capturing slave ships, what would become of the liberated Africans? If they landed in the South, they would be seized and sold, which was defeating the purpose. And if they landed in the North, the community there, in the big cities, were really not welcoming of free black people moving around the cities looking for jobs, even those who were born in the U.S., so to speak. So the compromise was, if our ships liberate Africans, carry them to Liberia and place them there.
One ship in particular I want to touch on is the Pons, Pons.
Mm-hmm.
This was a ship that had mostly children on board.
Mm-hmm.
What were the circumstances at the time that we would have a ship with mostly children?
Mm-hmm.
One, and two, this ship actually ended up in Liberia. And I can just imagine the strain on a new republic in terms of the social services, finance, and all of that. Touch on that a little bit.
Sure. The incident of the Pons, the arrival of the Pons, was shocking to the Liberian public. The mentality, the spirit of the people. When you look at the historical evidence, you look at the stories that were written in the papers and people's journals and what have you, you can tell it was something that people had never seen, before. Here's the reality as to why there were so many young people on that ship, and it was not an anomaly at that time. A lot of ships were packed with young people who were being brought to the Americas. But here is the chronology of the slave trade, so to speak. When it first started, right, it really kicked off, let's say, in the 1600s. It had been ongoing for a while, but on a smaller scale. Intensifies in the 1600s. Okay. Initially, the demand was for men, adult males, who would come and immediately hit the ground working. Plantations, or working in mines, or there was work to be done. Over time, the traffic changed demographically, and the slave buyers wanted women and men. They had tasks that they wanted women to do, but then they also were interested in the population, quote unquote, reproducing itself. So they started telling the sellers, the kidnappers, not only men, we also want you to catch some women too. But after the British abolished the trade in captured Africans, right? The buyers said, we want more children, because if we can get Africans here young, then they will have a longer lifespan. And if we get a mix of boys and girls, then they would reproduce over time and will not need to keep bringing more Africans here. So the character of the slave trade changed to where they now started hunting children. And there were 900 plus people on the Pons when the ship was seized by a U.S. naval anti-squadron vessel. By the time it could come from Cabinda to Liberia, about 200 had died. The conditions on the ship were just horrible. There was an outbreak of disease. There was not enough food. Sometimes the water that they would put on board for the journey across the Atlantic was not fresh. These were not ideal conditions. And so within that period of travel from Cabinda to Liberia, about 200 people had already died. As people were getting off the ship, they were dying.
So the ship arrives in Monrovia. What happened?
Yeah, so it arrives, and some of the pastors who went, wrote entries about it, and they described human beings looking like skeletons, looking like Egyptian mummies, and so on. But once the people were taken off the ships, the question was, what do we do with all these children? And the community decided that the children would be placed with existing families. So the appeal was made to Liberian families to say, would you be willing to take these children in, nurture them, foster them, train them, educate them, and they'll become a part of the Liberian community. So initially, the children from the Pons were placed with families and with missionaries. The boarding schools worked, in some ways to help in that condition, because the kids would be on the boarding school or mission school, as we used to call them, right, for extended periods. So there are families in Liberia who came out of the Congolese community, and the names are still with us today. Okay. There's a Koranda family, and we know that the initial branch of that family was placed with the Lewises, the John N. Lewis family. And the first generation carried the name Lewis. But when their descendant was at CWA in the early 1900s, he changed his name to Doba Karanda. And then he named one of his sons, Doba Jr., and he had other children who carried the Karanda name. Yeah.
So,
and then another was Kanga,
okay.
Abayemi Kanga, who was a justice and a member of the legislature in Liberia, also came out of that community.
So my takeaway from the story, not the story, the fact of the Pons, right? That ship with all those children. There was a certain sadness that came over me again. And then once the sadness left, a question came to mind, and I'm going to try to be as objective as possible in asking this question. I'm going to have to ask it anyway. So we, when I say we, meaning people on the continent, people like Conneau, all of these slave traders could not have been successful without us being with them in catching our people and then bringing them to the coast to sell. Without apportioning collective guilt or blame, who were some of the people who were involved in the slave trade from the continent? Is that a fair question to ask from a purely historical and as well as a therapeutic standpoint?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a very critical question and a fair question, that we must ask ourselves. So because it is a crucial question, I would take a slight issue with your original framing when you talked about us,
Okay.
right? The us. Because I find that we do that sometimes, and when we do, it shelters the actual wrongdoers. It spreads the blame, across the board, and then we don't sharpen our focus on those who were the perpetrators, in fact. But I'll give you a brief answer to the question of who was responsible. There were individuals on the continent, and there were few, who, for reasons of greed, saw the kidnapping and selling of their fellow human beings as a way to make a profit. And they got involved in this, right? And they were successful in making their profit. I don't think the behavior is aberrant when we look at our societies today, where we see there are people who are available and willing to do whatever, you know what I mean? Even though it might damage the society, but they get involved and they keep going. Now, at that point, we don't have written records, but what is important is that there were oral traditions. And I have files of some of the oral traditions for different ethnic groups, right, in Liberia. One of the most startling would be from the Gola. And they were collected primarily by the late Honorable Jangaba Johnson. He was a member of the legislature. He also worked at one point with the Interior Department, the Bureau of Folklore. And in the collection, he documents a number of Gola leaders who were engaged, he says, according to the oral tradition, in the capture and selling of Gola people. So most slave catchers, African slave catchers, were preying on people from outside their ethnic groups, right? And so it became a tit for tat. You seize Mama, I come, I'll seize people, as many people from your village as possible. You come back to pay your debt and back and forth. But in this instance, the point that Jangaba Johnson makes is that there were many who we would identify as leaders in the Gola community who were seizing Gola people. Now, here's the thing, and I'm sorry to, go a little more scholarly and
right.
deeper in this issue, but I think it's very important for us to appreciate this. We tend to have this notion that culture remains static. And when we look back on the past, it's like everything that was existing was quote unquote tradition, right? When we talk about the founding of Liberia in the 1800s, it's like, oh, people came from outside. Their culture was different. Then they met people on the ground, and their culture was pristine, African. But that's not the case. You cannot have trading with the world, with the West, for 200, 300, 400 years, and your culture has not changed. So by the 1800s, not only did many of the local rulers or leaders have Western names like Peter, Long Peter, George, Governor, etc., but the very nature of rulership had changed. So if we look at the sale of land the land at Cape Mesurado, for example, to what became Liberia, the principal person involved was a day ruler named Tawe Peter, Tawe being his title. He was the landholder, right? The traditional ruler among the day in the area. But you had others in the region who were not traditional rulers. They were warlords.
Mm.
And that's the point in Jangawa Johnson's collection of oral traditions, that people had emerged among the Gola who were warlords. They received arms in exchange for captives. Then they would use those arms to go and capture more people. And because they were better armed than their neighbors, they could overpower the neighbors. The classic case, and this is a sad, example, was the man known as Zolu Duma. Zolu Duma. The unfortunate thing is, in Liberian mythology, people confuse Zolu Duma, whose English name was Peter Careful, with Tawe Peter, who lived on Busho Island. Yes. And as a result of the mythology, the previous government in Liberia, went and placed a plaque on the grave of Tawe Peter, naming it for Zolu Duma. And they name a bridge, Zolu Duma, close to where Tawe Peter lived. But Zolu Duma never reached Busho Island. There's no evidence that he was anywhere near there ever. He lived in Cape Mount. And here is the tragic story of Zolu Duma and how he became powerful. His sister was the matron of the Sandy Society. There was a class of girls about to graduate. He went to his sister and told her, he said, I have a friend. He's on a ship, came from overseas. I want you to bring the girls to dance on the ship for him. And he promised he would give them, some Western goods, trinkets, and what have you. And his sister said, oh, okay. So she brought the girls to the ship. And according to Gola oral tradition, Zolu Duma, who was Gola, had pre-sold the girls to the ship captain, unbeknownst to his sister. And the ship sailed with those girls on it. He went down in infamy in Gola history. So people remember the heroes, but they also remember the villains. But we got the man name on a bridge in Monrovia because of mythology. We don't respect history.
So one other thing I want to touch on is, we just had January 7th recently, about the arrival of the repatriates on Providence Island. you are on record as saying that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So how did we get mixed up on that aspect of our history and what really happened? Or how did January 7, Pioneers Day get to become such a significant milestone in our consciousness and in our history?
Yeah. Well, that's a deep question, and so I'll just say this to correct the record.
Okay.
Then we'll go into why.
Okay.
Right. One, we know that the first group of repatriates went to Freetown, and they arrived there in 1820. Then another group came. That group came on the Elizabeth. Another group came on the Nautilus to Freetown area. Chevron, that area. They were there. So when Captain Robert Stockton and Dr. Eli Ayres, Stockton was with the Navy, Ayres was with the ACS. When they were appointed to go look for land, Chevron proved to be inhospitable. They were going down the coast. They went in December, right, of 1821, and they took some sailors from Stockton's ship. He didn't carry the naval ship. They went on a boat, but he took some of his crew with him. And some of the repatriated men went with them in December. Are you following me? Of 1821. So those men were the first repatriated to reach Cape Mesurado area. After the negotiations were concluded, the local rulers had signed the agreement, all of that. Dr. Ayres was the person in charge, left there. Stockton had sailed immediately after the negotiations. He went back to the States. So Ayres leaves to go to Freetown to get supplies. As he's about to leave, the night before, he says to the repatriated men, I know you've been away from your family for a while. I would be understanding if you decide to come with me to Freetown, fully understand. And we can get refreshed and you can, be with the family and we can come back. And they said no. Lot Carey was one of them. Lot Carey spoke for the group. He said, we'd rather stay here. So this is December 1821, and they remain in the area on Providence Island. The group from Freetown, the women, children, did not come to Liberia until April. So why is January 7th significant? Ayres came back from Sierra Leone on January 7th, 1821, but he came with supplies.
1822 or 1821?
I mean, in 1822,
okay.
Excuse me, I misspoke. Right. In 1820, Ayres came from Freetown on January 7, 1822. Yeah. Yes? With supplies.
And by then, people were already in the Cape on Providence Island.
On Providence Island. Okay. Yeah. And they had been left there to put up a structure, and then they will be attempting to build, structures on the hill, right, on this land that they acquired. So when Ayres returned on the 7th, he met a big wahala, confusion, trouble, because there were people who came from what is now Magibi, and that area was a place inhabited by people of the Bassa ethnic group. The Mamba homeland is there, and the there's a Du River that runs down, into the Mesurado River. It starts in the homeland of the Du, the subgroup of the Bassa. So there were some leaders who came down, and they took Tawed Peter hostage. Now, they were the original people who settled in the area of Cape Mesurado, and he was a landholder. And the dude said, how you could sell the land, you didn't consult us. And they were from 20-something miles away. So they came and they were objecting. They didn't object, as some would have us believe, because you couldn't sell land in African tradition. That was not the case. They were objecting because they were not included. And they said they were going to behead him unless heirs would come and mediate and
And
negotiate with them.
renegotiate, basically.
Renegotiate. And in the end, they were able to get small something out of, they're holding him hostage. And that was fine. And once it was done, once it was concluded, and they got their part, they told him, oh, if you want land, you can come to where we live in and you will get land there too. Yes. So the 7th was only important because that was when heirs returned from Sierra Leone. How did we get to the mistake? People who read superficially the ACS records saw that heirs went to Freetown to get supplies. Mm-hmm. He came back on the 7th, and they jumped to a conclusion that he came back with the families that were in Sierra Leone. In Liberia, when we were young, we used to say, what happened when you assume things? Okay, I will leave it there. And so people assume this. However, when the government of Liberia declared January 7th to be Pioneers' Day.
Which government and who was the president at the time?
Oh, it was Tubman. It was 1955. Okay. The proclamation was issued. So they created this award of the pioneers, a national, honor decoration. They declared Pioneers' Day to be January 7th. But they didn't say in the proclamation that was the day the repatriates arrived. So the story took off. They didn't say that the pioneers were only repatriates because they had the name of Tawe Peter and so many other indigenous rulers included among the pioneers. What they were saying is that these are the people who laid the foundation of what became Liberia.
So where is that proclamation now? Where is a copy of that?
If I had known you were going to ask me, I have one right out. I had used it recently out here on one of my tables. You can send it to me after the program. But I have a copy. Yes, I have a copy.
Because this is
and I'm sure the foreign ministry has copies in the archives because they would have issued it. This
is an extremely important piece of our history that we sort of got wrong.
Let me say this, and I know it would sound like special pleading for someone who spent my life working on our history, but we really, as a group, as a nation, as a people, have lost our way because we devalue history, right? We devalue understanding the way of our ancestors, what they have done, what they achieved, what we substitute our assumptions. And I would say that most countries don't do that. Most societies don't do that. And it's got us going around in circles, and we really have to get out of this mindset, I think.
So on that note, Doc, we will end part 2. And that's not a very good cliffhanger, though. But let me tell you that in part 3, we'll begin by looking at the role of the repatriates in fighting the traffic, and we will lay the foundation that Liberia, the idea, Liberia actually laid the foundation for Pan-Africanism. In part 3, we'll talk about John B. Rusham, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Hilary Teach, and then bring in Blyden as well. So thank you so much again, Doc. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add this one point, because of where we are now in terms of our understanding of history, a lot of times people think that it's your opinion versus my opinion, and I don't like to project my opinions onto people. I say, please, if you can get your hands on Liberia and the Quest for Freedom, the evidence is there. The sources are there in the book, so that you can look at the sources and see, are you convinced by what those people from that time were saying? It's not just me. It's not my assumption.
Dr. Carl Patrick Burroughs, among other positions, he has served as Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Professor of Journalism at Marshall University, West Virginia, Vice President for Academic Affairs at my alma mater, Cottonton University College. Go Scorpions. And he got his MA from Howard in communications, his PhD from, his MA in communications from Syracuse, and a PhD from Temple University. Dr. Boris, thank you so much again. And I look forward to part 3 of our discussion, where we will make the argument that Liberia is the foundation of Pan-Africanism. Thank you so much again, Dr. Boris.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.